So yes, slight side project. It's one of those things where you start following threads and you end up working on Australian history, which as an Australian I studiously avoided the entire time I was there. But this is where we are. So, quick forewarning, there are some terms in this talk which are now considered offensive, but I have sort of tried to minimise those as much as possible. But I will crack on. So, there we go. As the Barmy Army likes to remind our cricket team, I know it's a controversial opening, the modern nation of Australia was at one point a place where Britain sent people convicted of felonies, so-called convicts. Between 1787 and 1868, Britain transported over 160,000 people to the Australian colonies. This started on the east coast with the land of the Eora Nation in the area now known as Sydney, New South Wales, which is in the red square. The other area to note is the southern island in the yellow square, which is now Tasmania, but at the time was known as Van Diemen's Land. And this was the second biggest site. Other convict settlements were sort of scattered around the country as time went on. Now, this system of transportation was not new. Australia formed part of what is sometimes called the Second British Empire, which mainly occupied the 19th and 20th centuries. While the Second Empire stretched right around the world, the First Empire was concentrated around the Atlantic Ocean, in North America and the West Indies. The key thing for us is that this included the colonies in what would become the United States of America, and that included transporting convicted criminals there since the early 17th century. But after gaining independence, the American colonies refused to accept any more British convicts. So very quickly, there was a backlog of people crammed in overcrowded prisons across England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Diseases spread rapidly, and so the authorities feared would rebellion. Transportation answered a lot of concerns. That I won't go into all of them here, but though Britain tried a few other sites in South America and Africa, all of which were disastrous, they turned to Australia pretty quickly. Now, it's customary to think of the convict population as injured by labour in the harsh conditions, and many were. But people arrived with a wide range of impairments, from mental illness to blindness to deafness to missing limbs. Surgeons' diaries and hospital records provide one kind of source material for finding out about them. But I'm interested in tracing how disabled prisoners lived more generally, their work and family lives, legal experiences, migration, and so on. I apologise, there's no chance you'll be able to read this from here. But the document on the screen is known as an indent, and it's a list of all the prisoners that arrived on the ship. In this case, the Isabella in 1832. This goes on for many pages. There were a few hundred on board. So the information here was taken when the ship arrived in Port Jackson, that is, Sydney. Before they were allowed to disembark, all the prisoners on board were inspected by an administrator. The originals are handwritten, but printed copies like this one were then made for different administrative bodies, both in Britain and in Sydney. So trawling through these lists allows me to spot people of interest who I can then chase through other records. And sort of working across the different columns, we have things like where they came from, what they were transported for, whether they were literate, their height, what else we got, their eye colour, their hair colour, their complexion colour, and then the last column, which you can sort of see has the lengthier records, it's general remarks, and this is where things get really interesting because they go into all sorts of very minute detail about everything that person can spot on that person's body. So we've got scars, we've got many, many, many tattoos, and quite often things like missing left leg. So the information here is pretty formulaic, but there was still a lot of personal judgment involved in what was recorded and how it was described. There's also human error, leading to discrepancies between records or omissions. Or sometimes there's practicality. So Irish labourer Michael Mostfame's indent is almost blank, with a note, "Muster not completed on account of the man's deafness." In other words, they couldn't ask him about his sentence or occupation, and he wasn't inclined to help them out. People also simply lied. So I'm currently trying to get to the bottom of a case from Merthyr Tydfil, just outside Cardiff, where a one-legged man named James Richardson pretended to be a half-pay army surgeon with a qualification from a fake Glaswegian university in order to extort money from people. Now, all the trial accounts affirm that he has no medical training or knowledge, but he nevertheless managed to have his occupation on his indent listed as surgeon. And he may have gone on to actually have a medical practice in Tasmania. Now, I have to say may there because I've got a few James Richardsons I'm trying to sort of sort through. So, watch this space. He also almost succeeded in hiding his one-leggedness from the inspector because originally the remarks go none, as in no interesting things about this person's body, and then they've had to scribble that out and go wooden leg. Prisoners were sentenced to transportation for life, 14 or 7 years. Most people did not serve this. Provided they behaved themselves in the penal colony, they could gain a ticket of leave early, sort of a probation system, and then a certificate of freedom. All prisoners were assigned to different jobs on arrival, depending on their skills. Some of these were under more control than others, such as road gangs, and there were eventually prisons, hospitals, and asylums that could be used to confine people on the grounds of bad behaviour or illness. But most people were assigned to work in the community for free settlers, who might well be former convicts themselves. Sydney largely operated as an open prison system, which is why the authorities needed such good records like the indents to keep track of the prisoners and to create identity documents, such as newspaper advertisements, when they ran away. Reports of assignment distributions in the weekly Government Gazette can give an insight into the different options. So, for example, in January 1834, the Royal Sovereign arrived in Port Jackson, that is the ship, not the king, with 168 male prisoners on board, 2 having died en route. The Gazette reported that of these men, 144 were assigned to private service, 8 to the Commissariat Department, that is government work gangs, and 3 to the Mounted Police in public service. A further 13 were unassigned. 2 of these were too old for assignment, 2 were sent to Port Macquarie as specials, I'll explain that in a moment, 3 were sent to the Invalid Department at Port Macquarie as idiots, and 5 were sent to the hospital and 1 to the Juvenile Boys Prison Carter's Barracks. So Port Macquarie, roughly 380 kilometres north of Sydney, was settled as a convict site from 1821, and in the 1830s it was reconfigured as an assignment site for, on one hand, physically and intellectually impaired convicts, and for the other, convicts described as specials, which were essentially gentlemen, who were therefore sort of set apart by their class status. It's kind of an odd combination. So before they reached Sydney, prisoners faced, obviously, many months in prisons, hulk ships, and then the transport ships. Healthcare on board ship and within the colonies played important roles in managing and creating disability within the convict and wider populations. Mortality and morbidity rates varied significantly between ships and have been investigated by many historians. The historiography of convict medicine has highlighted the detrimental impact of communicable diseases, malnutrition, and accidents over the long journey. But from 1798, convict and free emigrants to Australia enjoyed reasonable health provisions en route due to increased regulation of the surgeons on board. Catherine Foxhall has written extensively about the health provisions for prisoners before, during, and in the immediate aftermath of the voyage. Her book is in the library. I highly recommend it. And the indents are packed with the scarring of diseases like scrofula and smallpox, along with medical activities like inoculation, cupping, and phlebotomy. But we also see the marks of shipboard illnesses like scurvy, prisoners emaciated by seasickness, or the general accidents of rough seas. After 1815, all ships were required to have a surgeon on board. Each surgeon was required to keep a journal of his key cases and activities to justify himself to the Naval Board. These casebooks, which along with the indents are digitised on ancestry.com, so anyone can have a look, provide a wealth of detail on medical care on these ships. The surgeon had the right to refuse passengers on health grounds, and this was in their best interests in several respects. Not only would it make their job easier on board, but surgeons were paid a bonus for healthy prisoners that they delivered to the colonies. Jailers in Britain and Ireland were not supposed to send ill prisoners to the ships, whether they were contagious or simply too weak to make surviving the journey certain. Ship surgeons inspected and rejected candidates on health grounds, but they continually complain about ill prisoners being snuck on board. And notably, this is often when that prisoner has died, so the protests of subterfuge and deceit are therefore also careful rhetoric of self-defence. For example, Thomas Galloway, surgeon on the Asia, gives an account of the death of a 16-year-old prisoner named Joseph Hamlet on 20th of April 1833. Galloway insists that, quote, "This boy had been rejected by me at muster by reason of an ulcer upon his ankle of a very irritable appearance and from his generally debilitated state." Galloway states ambiguously that it was by some accident that Hamlet's name was included in the approval list. But then he adds critically that he this morning tells me he was told to say nothing of his complaints until we had left the harbour. That is, when it was too late to disembark him. Though Hamlet was treated on board and maintained an appetite, he was ultimately worn to a skeleton and died. His death was keenly felt by one of the other patients in the ship's hospital. Galloway records of one Peter Turner that the boy Hamlet's death has much affected him, this morning very despondent and more tractable. Now Turner had boarded the ship well, but would die on the 8th of May, meaning that he receives no description in his arrival documents beyond died at sea. It's thus only from Galloway's journal that we learn he was, quote, "a man of colour, born in England." Galloway believed that he was naturally of a thin, spare habit, although this might have been part of his underlying illness. The surgeon's subjectivity continues in his assessment of Turner as having an irritable temperament and indolent to excess, which is what makes his despondent and tractable turn after Hamlet's death worth noting. Galloway explains that Turner, quote, was brought forward by his berthmates this morning, accused of being too lazy to leave his bed at night, and had several nights past voided his faeces and urine in his bedplace. Has no particular complaint, but losing substance daily, notwithstanding a voracious appetite. Took him into hospital that he might be under the surveillance of the nurses. Obviously, that's the hospital booth on board ship. Now, note that he reads Turner's nocturnal activities as evidence of laziness rather than illness, despite the also confusing weight loss. Galloway reports no worms or anything unusual in the faecal matter. Turner's health and temperament continued to fluctuate until his death. Excuse me. So, convicts received access to medical care and in some cases improved living conditions compared to the cramped poverty spaces that many of them had left in Britain. Quarantine procedures were also implemented on arrival in Australia to protect the colony from infectious diseases. Some studies suggest that this led to better health outcomes for themselves and their descendants. For example, children in the colonies tended to grow taller than their contemporaries back home. In the New South Wales colony, they were supported by the Colonial Medical Service, and in 1816, a new general hospital was built at the command of Governor Macquarie. It was colloquially known as the Rum Hospital because it was ingeniously funded by Macquarie, giving three men a monopoly on spirit sales in exchange for them agreeing to construct the building, using free convict labour, obviously. Now, the General Hospital, along with the Benevolent Society, lunatic asylums at Castle Hill, Tarban Creek and Liverpool, and the Hyde Park Barracks, could also serve as long-term homes for those who were permanently incapacitated through infirmity or old age. There were further structures of more restrained support, such as the Invalid Gang. This was a work gang assigned to light duties, based on the convicts' incapacities. Beverly Earnshaw argued that assignment to an invalid gang was extremely restricted and required a warrant from a magistrate. Musters from Port Arthur in Tasmania show these crews assigned duties such as working in vegetable gardens. Nevertheless, numerous newspaper advertisements include men who have run away from an invalid gang, suggesting either a greater level of fitness than Earnshaw suggested, or a tendency to fake things until you got into one. What is certain is that many disabled prisoners were also given standard assignments and, indeed, punishments. In 1834, one Ambrose Goldsmith was charged by his master, a Mr. Underwood, with repeated drunkenness, although in other respects he was an honest and good servant. Norfolk-born Goldsmith had arrived in 1832, aged 29, with his skill set described as waggoner, porter and ploughman. He was immediately assigned to R. Smith of Maitland, and it's unclear when he was then moved to Underwood's employment or what kind of work he was doing there. What's notable is that the news report on this court case describes him as, quote, a cripple having lost one arm. The indent describes it as only lost left hand from the wrist, so ambiguity in the record there. But notes, moreover, that he had recently fallen in a state of intoxication and broke his leg, from which he has scarcely recovered. Despite this, he was sentenced to be worked on the treadmill for 3 days and then returned to service. Women would instead be sent to the hospital, or what's called the female factory. Elizabeth Gilligan arrived in Australia in 1831 with a broken right leg that caused her to halt and was first sent to the hospital. She still carried this injury when she ran away from her mistress, Mrs. Harriet Howell, in May 1833. She apparently returned because she ran away again on the 2nd of June. Gilligan escaped yet again in August, still with the effects of her injury, quote, right leg being broken and halts. So her limp was thus no impediment to either assignment or escape. In some cases, the indents hint at the economic impact of disability in the prisoner's background that may have contributed to their crimes. Although, since over 3/4 of people were transported for sort of relatively minor property offences, I wouldn't want to push that too far. But Margaret McAvoy, aged 27, from County Down, was transported for stealing money. She travelled with her son, who must have been illegitimate because she's listed as single. She had her, quote, right arm disabled, and her occupation was listed as lost the use of right arm, suggesting it had caused her to be out of work for quite a long time. Her assignment is left blank in the indent, so I don't know where she went. Jewish Londoner Lewis Henry arrived in New South Wales, aged 23, on the Exmouth, and he was an ornamental painter who was transported for 2 separate thefts. Henry is described as having weak eyes, along with pale freckled skin, sandy hair, dark brown eyes, and a horizontal scar on his forehead. His cousin, Benjamin Henry, had been sent to Van Diemen's Land 11 years earlier. Perhaps his weak eyes had been caused by that close work in his occupation, or had compelled him to turn to theft to supplement his income. Speculation, but worth thinking about. So, who were these 160,000 prisoners? One of the things that I want to stress here is that this population was significantly more diverse than popular history has led us to believe. The prisoners included men and women. Some people don't know that. They were sent on separate ships. And we frequently see notes about family members arriving on separate boats after being convicted together, or even many years apart. So far from always being isolated individuals cast to the end of the world, it's sometimes families and friends who've committed a crime together and would thus carry their family and village beliefs and arguments across the world. The prisoners included people in their 80s and children as young as 10. Even younger children were transported out if their parents were prisoners. There are Welsh and Irish speakers, some of whom didn't speak English. I haven't found any Scots yet, but I'll keep looking. Such was the antagonism between English and Irish prisoners that they were usually sent on separate ships. And there's also religious diversity, with the majority Protestants and Catholics accompanied by occasional Jews, Hindus, heathens and Muslims. And the convict population included people from all around the world. Obviously, many people from across England, Scotland, Wales and Ireland, and the Irish were one of the biggest cohorts, if not the biggest, because transportation formed a key tool in Britain's arsenal of control over Irish rebellion. But we also have Indigenous Maori from New Zealand and Indigenous Hawaiians, along with Americans, Canadians, people from the Middle East and South Asia. Some of these people were transported because they were convicted in British colonies, such as India, Malta, Gibraltar, British West Africa, the Cape Colony, now South Africa, or islands like Jamaica in the West Indies. Other people, especially men, were sailors from other regions who had ended up on British ships because ship crews were incredibly international in this period. There are also formerly enslaved Africans, such as those who had fought on the British side in the American Revolutionary War and thus gained their freedom. And even from within Britain, we get glimpses of national and ethnic diversity, as migrants or Britons of colour fall foul of the law and wind up in Australia. So these are some portraits I commissioned for an event from a Cardiff artist named Rosemary Baker, based on some of these indent descriptions. So we've got a Limerick housemaid called Mary Healy, 14-year-old Michael Nolan, a boy from Ireland. We've got a Hawaiian sailor who's listed as Black Tom, and a Northumberland miner and soldier, David Jarks, and you might just be able to make out he's got the tattooed D for desertion on his arm, which was actually quite a common thing among deserting soldiers who wind up in Australia for a second offence. Now, historians have been illuminating these histories over the past couple of decades in what is sometimes called the new history from below, which has a very old history, but that's a whole different story. The organisation and preservation of the massive physical Australian archive has only been a priority since the 1950s, since previous generations were ambivalent at best about the impact of the convict stain on national and family histories. Neglect and destruction have left unnecessary gaps, and for many years, historians were not allowed to name individuals lest it disturb living descendants. In the 19th century, at least, there remained the belief that criminality itself could be an inherited disability, and influential early historiography emphasised physical and mental weaknesses among the population. Even today, the microfilmed and now digitised records carry a notice that, imagine this in all caps, by order of the Archives Authority of New South Wales, the information contained in these records must not be used in any manner likely to cause pain or embarrassment to any living person. But nowadays, it's a point of pride, and family historians play a crucial role in teasing out individual stories. And having a convict in the family has flipped from being a family stain to, as I said, a point of pride, provided they weren't convicted of anything too terrible. All right, so as was mentioned, my particular interest is finding disabled prisoners. So I use the social model of disability, which separates out the thing that is different about the mind or the body, generally termed an impairment, and the effects of the environment and society that turn that into a disability. So it's a productive way of being able to understand how the disabling effects of different impairments change according to location, time, and the individual circumstances, such as, their economic status. Disability history also differs from the social history of medicine, which is also sort of more concerned with patients, in that it's interested in people outside of any medical encounters or interpretations. So we follow them to church, to work, to weddings, regardless of whether or not they have anything to do with a doctor. No offence. Now, I'm focusing on convicts here, but it must be pointed out that free immigrants also carried impairments. When the American-born convict, Linus Wilson Miller, entered the master's quarters of the canton in order to have his description taken in January 1840, he noted that the principal superintendent of convicts for Van Diemen's Land, a man called William Gunn, was a very respectable-looking man with but one arm. In 1860, a free deaf migrant named Thomas Patterson founded the Deaf and Dumb Institution in Sydney to educate deaf children, and from 1870 it also admitted blind children. He had previously been a treasurer, secretary and assistant teacher at the Edinburgh Deaf and Dumb Benevolent Society for about 20 years. And one of the pupils at that Edinburgh school was John Carmichael, born 1803. He described himself as deaf and dumb, emigrated to Sydney in 1825, and then had a successful career as an engraver until his death in 1857. Now, historians have investigated the health and physical strength of people selected for transportation or free settlement in the colonies in a number of ways. Free settlers would become particularly subject to biopolitical requirements as the colonies became more established, and authorities grew increasingly concerned about the kinds of people allowed to settle in their territories. In the 1970s, Brian Gandiva read convict indents for evidence of health and impairment in comparison to other British populations, generally linking transportees' poor health and short stature to their lower class and urban origins. The extent to which convicts were accepted or rejected based on factors including health and disability has been a hot topic of debate. Andrew Piper goes so far as to argue that, quote, Britain deliberately and systematically used the transportation system to convey invalid convicts from its shores to the Australian colonies. On the other hand, Deborah Oxley, Richard Ward and Lucy Williams have argued that youth, good health and physical capacity were desired criteria for transportees, but that there's no evidence for any systematic use in sentencing. Even within the First Fleet, there were individuals who could be considered disabled from the difficult physical labour expected in the new settlement. In July 1788, so less than 6 months after they landed, the surgeon in charge of the hospital tent reported that he was presently overseeing 36 Marines and 66 convicts receiving medical treatment, and that there were another 52 individuals unfit for labour from old age or infirmities. Now, these older felons might be imprisoned rather than transported, but this was not universal. Among the 10 deaths on board the Asia, two were men aged about 76, whom the surgeon diagnosed as having died from natural decay. Benjamin Wanstall and John Edgoose, both transported for theft. In his general remarks at the end of the journal, Galloway offers his opinion that such elderly and infirm men should not be transported, describing Wanstall and Edgoose as hapless wretches who were so feeble and infirm on embarkation as to require a person to assist them to and from deck, even in fine weather. That Wanstall and Edgoose required help to manage the stairs to and from deck, even in fine weather, was a marker of the extent to which their physical impairments disabled them on board. Going on deck was a key means of not only preserving health by escaping the damp and airless space below, but also in engaging with the camaraderie and time-passing activities on board the long journey. Men who might have been eligible for a reprieve if that was conditional on assignment to the Army or Navy, but who were impaired, could instead be sent to Australia. So we have a guy called Thomas Poor, transported 1796, who possessed a lame hand, rendering him unfit for the Navy. So he ends up in Australia instead. In her sample of male convicts transported to New South Wales, Beverly Earnshaw found that in the 1826 to 29 arrivals, 5.1% of men were described in their indent as having a physical or mental impairment, which decreased in her data to 3.9% in 1836 to 38. So she hypothesised that slightly earlier generation might have been veterans of the Napoleonic Wars, and actually found several examples of men attributing their injuries to those battles. So even if health was desirable, impairments such as deafness, limps, a single blind eye and more were no barriers to transportation or assignment. And I'll close with a few sort of brief case studies where sufficient records are letting me trace some individuals. So first off, we've got James Cannon, arrived at 28 years old, a married father of 3 from Hertfordshire. He is described as a farm servant and shepherd, and perhaps unsurprisingly, had been convicted of sheep stealing by the Hertfordshire Assizes. It's very, very common that whatever occupation they have stolen something relevant to that occupation. It's what they had at hand. And he had a mole on the left side of his neck and 3 small moles on his left breast. His breast was also described as hairy, which is a further reminder that these inspections were done shirtless. Cannon's other note is that he is sallow-complexioned and sickly-looking. So Surgeon George Roberts had treated Cannon on board the Heroine from the 3rd of May to the 5th of June. He had initially complained of acute pains in his extremities, especially the knee and ankle joints, and great weakness in his lower extremities, which renders him at times unable to walk. This suggests an inability of him to move about the ship without assistance. Rest, diet, and medication rendered him convalescent by the close of Robert's account, but it is evident that he remained weak in appearance by the time the ship docked. This description was repeated when he ran away from assignment to Reverend Matthew Devonish Mears of Pitttown on the 6th of August 1835, but not when he ran on the 30th of November the same year. Now, the Irish-born Mears was at this point living with his wife and 8 children, and the Gazette shows that he had several assigned convicts, and even that Cannon was not the first to run away. So in September 1834, he also lost housemaid Mary Maloney and a 16-year-old nurse girl, Margaret Connors. While Mears had taken him back after the first escape, 2 was evidently too much. We see Cannon returned to 1836 punishment. So while Mears had been satisfied to copy the indent description in his original notice, he had evidently revised the description for the second. And this suggests that Cannon was no longer sickly looking, but had instead recovered from whatever had ailed him on board 2 years earlier. Now, Cannon ends happily. Cannon gained a ticket of leave in 1841, although this was revoked because he gains another in 1846. But by then, in 1848, he has his conditional pardon and becomes a free man, at which point he disappears from the records. So it's always a bittersweet moment when everyone says, yeah, you're free, and I can no longer find out what happens. Good luck. Next on our list, we have Mary Ann Reid, 5 feet 1 inches tall. She's a shoebinder, needlewoman, and housemaid from Kent, who had absconded 3 times already when she ran away from W.N. Cable of Bathurst in September 1836. Now, after being convicted of theft in London, Mary Ann had arrived on the second voyage of the Roslyn Castle in 1830 and was first assigned to A. Watts of Bathurst, then J. Liscombe of the same town, so she sort of remains Bathurst-wise. The advertisement description copies details from her arrival indent. She has a ruddied, freckled complexion, light brown hair, grey eyes, and tattoos of a shield, upper part of the right arm bone, and 9th of July 1808 James Fuller on her left. But it adds a further detail that she speaks with a lisp. And this was probably not noticed at that inspection on board ship, but became apparent in the working conditions of Watts's house in Bathurst. Despite her absconding habits, Mary Ann received her ticket of leave in 1842 and was a fully freed woman in 1852. Again, by Mary Ann. John Hennessy, 19, convicted of theft when he arrived on the Mangles in 1824. Now, his entrance in the Parramatta jail description book describes his occupation as none, and there's no physical description. His Old Bailey trial provides no hints, and the physical description in his conditional pardon relates to, eye, hair colour, freckles, etc. But a runaway advertisement describes him as a cripple and working for the Reverend Thomas Hassell as an usher. Now, it's hard to say whether this was only a temporary impairment. Was it how he ended up with employment that wasn't particularly physically strenuous? Was this sort of a condition that was made to his physical capacity? Yet to be confirmed. At the sort of other end of the spectrum, Charles Hayter had lost his left hand. He was 55 years old on arrival, with brown to grey and bald hair. The literate shepherd and farm servant from Salisbury was married with 4 children and was transported, along with several of his shipmates, for his part in the destruction of several sacking machines at Fordingham in November 1830, part of the swing riots that cascaded across the country that year. A witness in Hayter's trial, Fordingham resident Samuel Wing, had testified to hearing rioters chatting at a public house in Fordingham the evening after the riot, where he, quote, heard a man say, pointing to Hayter, "I'll be damned if that old man there did not do more harm with his one arm in breaking the machinery than any man with 2. They got in brackets, Hayter had only one arm. Hayter heard the remark and said he had done a great deal. He had a bar of iron in his hand, something like a spit, but not so long. Hayter seemed in liquor at the time. Hayter indeed pleaded that he had been in liquor when he boasted about his role in breaking the machines. But it didn't work. He was transported. But he was one of the men offered a pardon in 1839 on the condition that he remained in the colony and never attempted to come back to Britain. I'd like to point out female amputees were also transported. So Henrietta Williams arrived on the Cairns in 1831, missing her left leg. She was 27 years old, 5 feet 4 3/4 inches tall. She was married without children, but could read or write, and she lived in Southwark and worked as a needlewoman until she was transported for stealing counterfeit coins. Now, she was listed as not assignable on the first landing, and I sort of haven't been able to find what happens to her, so we'll bear that with me. But she received her certificate of freedom 1837, so she's still alive and well and kicking, so to speak. Finally, Henry Whittenbury was missing his right leg and carried a scar on the front of his left leg, which had been broken. He testified in his trial that he had lost his leg due to the king's evil, that is, scrofula. He was 5 feet 4 1/2 inches, with a sallow complexion, brown hair, and grey to blue eyes. He arrived in 1831, aged 29, a single man from Edmonton who could both read and write. He had completed his shoemaker's apprenticeship, but was convicted of stealing from his master. Unfortunately, it was not his first offence. In January 1827, he was convicted of stealing a bag to the value of 4p and containing 1 sovereign, 3 half-crowns and 5 shillings from a Reading mason, James Munday, with whom he shared a lodging-house bed in Marylebone. The offence was proven, but the prisoner received a good character and was subsequently recommended to mercy, so he was fined a shilling and discharged. Now, this offence and punishment is not included in the former convictions column of his indent, indicating mercy really was shown in effectively wiping the offence from his record. In December 1830, Whittenbury was living in the combined workshop and residence of a shoemaker, Samuel Umfreville, in Bethnal Green, and he was accused of stealing 4 pairs of children's boots and breaking out of the house to escape. Umfreville paid Wittenbury for piecework, making shoes, rather than as an employee, and took money for his lodging out of it. Wittenbury maintained that Umfreville had used him very cruel, saying after a week that his work would not do and that he should leave. Wittenbury asked for payment, was given only sixpence. Quote, "He said my work was not fit to be seen and he would give me no more," although he then assigned him the children's boots. On the night of the 13th of December, he left unannounced, taking the shoes with him. Now, in training as a shoemaker, one of the so-called sitting trades, Wittenbury was more prepared than others to manage an impairment such as a lost leg. According to testimony given by policeman James Fitzgerald, Wittenbury himself thought the first justice had taken pity on him on account of his disability, saying as he was taken to the station, "I know I'm done this time. I have been in prison before. I have been to the Old Bailey not long ago, and if I had the use of my other leg, I should have been hung by now." He emphasised that he had approached Umfreville in an economically distressed position on account of his disability, and that in being dismissed by him, he must go to the workhouse. I was so bad. Within his defence, he maintained that he could not have jumped the 6-foot yard wall, but unfortunately his roommate testified that the gate was open. On arrival in Australia, Wittenbury was assigned straight off the boat to William Faithfull, who held substantial land in Richmond. No question of the invalid gang there. Wittenbury received his conditional pardon in August 1848, and at some point he relocated to Melbourne, where he continued to work as a shoemaker. He died in Melbourne in 1865, aged 64. At the inquest into his sudden death, a hairdresser named Henry Coverlid testified that he had known Wittenbury for 11 years and that he had been in the hospital suffering from rheumatism, but he came out quite well. And he went back to work on the Tuesday. Another shoemaker, James H. Jebb, also testified that Wittenbury came home on Friday night and went to bed, perhaps indicating they shared lodgings. Dr. James Motherwell also testified that he believed his cause of death to be a severe apoplexy. Now, I haven't found a marriage notice for him, and it's not unrealistic to say he may have been disadvantaged in a marriage market where men could outnumber women 10 to 1, depending on when in the century you look. But he evidently maintained an independent living until his death. Now I'm going to wrap up here. But what I hope is clear is that sort of chasing individual stories allows me to build up a more nuanced picture of this massive transportee population, who otherwise sort of tend to disappear into those figures. Moreover, the descriptions in the indents are providing a different way of identifying disabled people in this population, the ones who didn't end up on the Benevolent Society's relief list or admitted to an asylum or hospital, but who were instead able to get on with things in the colony, even if they had been driven to the margins back here. This is both British history and Australian history, and health and disability played key roles. Thank you.